Here is a sentence that sounds absolutely ridiculous, like it cannot possibly be true. At some point in the last few tens of thousands of years, the human brain actually got smaller. It lost roughly 10% of its total volume. If you line up a skull from an Ice Age human next to a modern human skull, the ancient one is noticeably larger. Over the course of our recent history, we have lost roughly the volume of a tennis ball straight off the top of the most complex object we know of in the known universe. For millions of years, the evolutionary story of the human brain only ever moved in one single direction, and it's the version most of us grew up hearing in school: bigger brains equal a smarter species. It meant more tools, more complex art, more survival strategies, more everything. But then, somewhere along the way, that trend abruptly reversed, and here is the wildest part. Scientists still do not agree on when this happened, why it happened, or whether it even means anything bad for us. When you dive into this topic looking for a clean, textbook answer, what you find instead is a live, fiercely debated scientific argument. Researchers are actively and publicly contradicting each other, so let's go through this properly and look at the main suspects. First, let's look at the boring explanation because it deserves a fair hearing. Brains do not exist in total isolation. Bigger bodies generally require bigger brains just to operate them. You need more neurological power to coordinate more muscle mass and more sensory surface area. So the absolute simplest idea is that human bodies just got smaller after the Ice Age, most likely as our diets shifted with the widespread adoption of farming, and the brain simply shrank down proportionally, just coming along for the ride. Under this theory, there is no grand mystery, no tragic decline in our ability to think, just a simple proportional scaling down of the human machine. But the human brain is an outrageously expensive organ to keep running. Despite being a tiny fraction of your total body weight, it eats up a hugely disproportionate share of your daily energy budget. Just sitting there doing nothing but thinking, your brain is burning calories like a furnace. This led researchers Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler to propose something called the expensive tissue hypothesis. They wanted to explain how humans could afford such a costly brain in the first place. Their answer was that something else in the body had to get cheaper to compensate. The organ that shrank to pay for our giant brains was the gut. As ancient human diets shifted toward higher quality, cooked, easier to digest food, our digestive tracts could get smaller. This freed up massive amounts of energy that got redirected upward to fuel this incredibly expensive brain. So, if energy is the whole story, and human diets shifted again much later, perhaps becoming less nutrient-dense during the dawn of agriculture, could the exact reverse have happened? Could the body have started reallocating energy away from the brain to survive? It is a very clean, physiological explanation. The problem is, when researchers actually test this brain shrinkage against body size changes in the fossil data, the drop in brain size looks significantly larger than body size alone can mathematically explain. So something else must be happening. This brings us to suspect number 2, an idea that a lot of serious researchers take very seriously, and it still catches people off guard the first time they hear it. Humans may have domesticated themselves. Look at almost any domesticated animal next to its wild ancestor. Place a golden retriever next to a wild wolf, or a farm fox next to a wild fox. There is a repeating pattern across totally unrelated species. Smaller skulls, smaller teeth, softer and more youthful-looking faces, vastly less aggression, and very often, smaller brains. Researchers Brian Hare and Richard Wrangham have aggressively argued that something very similar happened to us, just without a human breeder making the choices. Their idea is that early human groups increasingly punished extreme aggression from within. A violently dominant individual was much more likely to get ganged up on, exiled, or killed by the group than to thrive and reproduce. If you do that consistently, generation after generation, you create a very real selection pressure. It is the exact same kind of pressure that shapes domesticated species elsewhere. Except here, humans did it to themselves through social punishment and cooperation instead of a breeder's hand. And the skeletal evidence lines up in a genuinely eerie way. Over this exact same time window, human skulls do get less rugged and more juvenile looking. Our brow ridges shrink, our faces get shorter and softer. Some researchers connect this directly to lower testosterone exposure during development, perfectly echoing changes documented in animals deliberately bred for tameness. The most famous version of that animal comparison is a real, decades-long experiment in Siberia. Starting in 1959, geneticist Dmitry Belyaev and later his colleague Lyudmila Trut began breeding silver foxes for exactly one specific trait. Calmness around humans, just pure tameness. Within just a handful of generations, entirely new physical traits started showing up that nobody had selected for directly. The foxes developed floppy ears, curly tails, patches of white fur, and faces that stayed incredibly puppyish well into adulthood. It is one of the most famous demonstrations in modern biology that selecting for just one behavioral trait can drag a whole cluster of unrelated physical traits along with it. So naturally, everyone assumed that brain size would predictably shrink in those tame foxes too, perfectly matching the classic domestication pattern. Except when researchers actually scanned the brains of those tame foxes in high detail recently, that is not quite what they found. The tamed foxes didn't show reduced overall brain volume at all. If anything, certain brain regions were actually larger compared to ordinary farm-bred foxes. Even stranger, foxes that were bred for the exact opposite trait, heightened aggression, showed some of the exact same neural changes. So, even the flagship experiment behind the domestication shrinks the brain idea turned out to be vastly more complicated than the simple version everyone repeats. Selecting for tameness clearly rewires the brain, it just isn't obviously the same thing as shrinking it. Which means suspect 2 isn't completely cleared, but it is definitely not an open and shut case either. So on to the next suspect we go. A completely different team of researchers proposed something almost sideways to the other explanations. Maybe individual brains got smaller because human societies got smarter. Not less intelligent people, but less need for any one person to carry the full cognitive load alone. Here's a simple way to picture it. Imagine 2 people, Bob and Alice, living in very different kinds of groups. Bob lives 30,000 years ago in a small, isolated band. If Bob doesn't personally know how to track an animal, treat a wound, start a friction fire, navigate by the stars, and remember exactly which plants are poisonous, nobody is necessarily around to fill that gap for him. His own head has to hold almost everything his absolute survival depends on. Alice lives thousands of years later in a much larger, more interconnected society with trade routes, specialists, and shared knowledge passed between groups. Alice doesn't need to personally know how to do everything. Someone else in her network is the dedicated healer, someone else is the master toolmaker, someone else studies the stars. Alice can lean heavily on the network instead of carrying it all herself. The researchers behind this hypothesis leaned on a highly unusual comparison to make their case: ant colonies. In some ant species, individual ants actually have smaller brains than their solitary ancestors, even as the colony as a whole becomes capable of dramatically more complex, coordinated behavior. When a group starts sharing information, dividing labor, and specializing, no single member needs to personally hold everything in their own head. Intelligence starts living in the network as much as in any one individual. Applied to Alice's connected world instead of Bob's isolated one, that is a genuinely elegant idea. And then, another team of researchers came along and picked the whole thing apart. A separate group went back to the exact same kind of fossil evidence and reached a strikingly different conclusion. There was no meaningful brain size reduction at all across the entire recorded history of our species. Their critique was pointed, specific, and devastating. The original sample size covering the critical time window was incredibly small, just a couple dozen skulls. Those skulls were pulled from wildly different parts of the world and lumped together as if agriculture, social complexity, and diet had all magically changed everywhere on Earth at exactly the same moment, which they demonstrably didn't. Furthermore, if the outsourcing knowledge to complex societies idea were correct, you would expect the timing of any brain shrinkage to differ region by region, depending on when complex societies actually showed up locally. Their brutal reanalysis found no such regional pattern and essentially no statistically significant reduction at all. For a while this looked like case closed. The shrinking brain was a myth, except the case didn't stay closed. More recently, a much larger analysis revisited the whole question using nearly 1,000 skulls instead of a couple dozen, and it landed squarely on brain shrinkage again, but this time it came with a massive plot twist. The timing wasn't 20,000 or 30,000 years ago at all. It pointed to something far more recent, only around 3,000 years ago, well inside recorded history. This places the drop somewhere around the era of early human empires and the widespread adoption of writing systems. And that same research team directly tested whether body size, diet, or self-domestication could explain the drop. According to their own massive analysis, none of those fully accounted for it. This quietly puts even the earlier suspects back on trial, including the very domestication idea we just spent several minutes on. So where does that honestly leave us? We have two credible research teams, two incredibly different timelines, and a genuine, ongoing public disagreement about whether this even happened at all, let alone why. That is not the tidy, satisfying ending I went in hoping to find, but it might be the most honest one available right now. Before this spirals into an existential crisis about the size of your own skull, here is something worth sitting with. Even the researchers who are incredibly confident that the brain shrank are quick to say that a smaller brain does not mean modern humans think worse than Ice Age humans. Brain size and intelligence just aren't the exact same measurement. Women's brains are, on average, slightly smaller than men's due to overall body size, with absolutely no corresponding gap in cognitive ability. Going back further, Neanderthals, our closest extinct relatives, actually had larger average brain volumes than modern humans do, without clear evidence that it translated into greater intelligence. Some researchers argue a smaller brain could simply be a vastly more efficient brain, better organized wiring, doing much more with less raw material. It is strikingly similar to how a tiny modern microprocessor can completely outperform a massive, bulky computer built a decade earlier. So even inside the "yes, it genuinely shrank" camp, the most interesting question isn't, are we getting dumber? It is what actually changed inside the wiring, not just the outer size. And that question is still incredibly wide open. You might ask, isn't the newest study just going to get refuted too, the exact same way the last one was? Maybe. That's a completely fair thing to wonder. And honestly, it is part of why this topic is so fascinating to revisit. Science working exactly like this, with claims getting tested, challenged, and relentlessly retested against bigger data sets, isn't a sign that the field is broken. It is exactly what a live, unresolved biological question is supposed to look like.